My name is Diane Moore. I'm 68 years old. And last spring, my son and his wife left me at a rural train station with a thermos of tea and a folded note taped beneath a wooden bench. That's how this all began. It started on a Wednesday morning when Jenna called me out of the blue. Her voice was soft. Too soft. Like someone reading lines they practiced in the mirror. She said she and Adam had planned a surprise for Mother's Day. Something light-hearted and sweet. They wanted to take me on a countryside train ride through Michigan. A restored locomotive. Vintage cars. Gentle music. And views of wide-open cornfields. It sounded like something from an old postcard. And I hadn't done anything like that in years. She said Adam thought it would be healing. That word caught me off guard. Healing. I paused when I heard it. I asked from what? But she just laughed and said I'd see. I thanked her. Not because I believed any of it, but because part of me still wanted to. I hadn't spent real time with them in months. There were only occasional check-ins. Short visits. Birthdays missed. And holidays quietly skipped. I had learned not to expect much. But the train ride felt intentional. And I wanted to believe they still saw me as family. Adam didn't call me. He just sent a text later that night that read, "Can't wait." It didn't sound like him. But I let it go. I packed an overnight bag. Just in case. I brought the lavender scarf Frank gave me on our last trip together before he passed. I tucked in a small notebook and a pen. Even though I hadn't written in weeks, they picked me up in Jenna's car the next morning. She wore a neat cream-colored blouse and a yellow scarf tied around her neck like an airline hostess from the 50s. Adam didn't say much. He stared at his phone most of the ride and nodded politely when I asked about work. His eyes looked tired. I thought maybe something was going on. But again, I didn't ask. The train station was small, tucked behind an old grain mill. It smelled like wet wood and distant smoke. There were only a few passengers milling about. Jenna handed me a warm thermos of chamomile tea and said they needed to check something with the conductor. She kissed my cheek and smiled the way you do when you're saying goodbye without really saying it. Then she and Adam walked to the far end of the platform. I sat on the bench, sipping the tea, watching the morning sun catch on the metal rails. I waited. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. I stood and walked to where they had disappeared. But there was no sign of them. No voices. No movement. I called out once. Then again. Nothing. That's when I saw the note. It was folded and taped under the bench where I had been sitting, in handwriting that looked too careful. It read, "If she still has her mind, she'll find her way back." The words didn't land all at once. They sank in slowly, like cold water filling a room. I read them again and again. My hand trembled slightly. But I didn't tear the note. I folded it the way I used to fold grocery lists before tucking them in my coat. I stood there for a long time. The train groaned on the tracks, pulling away from the platform. There was no phone in my bag. No keys. Just a scarf. A thermos. And a notebook that suddenly felt too empty. I stepped back inside the station. But the clerk was gone. And the place was quiet. Too quiet. It was the kind of silence that doesn't feel natural. The kind that fills up space where warmth should be. I sat again. Then stood. Then sat again. My knees buzzed like they used to after standing too long at the stove. But it wasn't physical this time. It was something else. I pressed my hand to my chest. I wasn't confused. I wasn't lost. I had been left. That difference mattered more than I could explain. I walked outside. Down the gravel path that led away from the platform. And onto the road with no real plan in mind. The sun had shifted behind a slow gray cloud. It wasn't cold. But it felt colder. My scarf smelled faintly of lavender and old hope. I held on to that and started walking. The road stretched out ahead like something forgotten. Cracked pavement gave way to gravel, and gravel turned to packed dirt. My legs moved without thinking. One step, then another, as if the only way to stop from feeling was to keep moving forward. There were no cars, no houses for the first few miles, just bare trees, quiet fields, and the occasional crow perched on a wire. The thermos in my hand grew cold. My feet began to ache. But I didn't slow down. I focused on the sound of the wind, the feel of my scarf brushing my collar, the rhythm of my steps. Everything inside me felt shaky and still at once. Like a jar, someone had just stopped shaking. My thoughts circled the same few phrases. Why? How long? Did they mean for it to be permanent? I didn't have answers. Only the memory of Adam looking past me in the car and Jenna's kiss that didn't feel real. By the time the sun had shifted overhead, I'd stopped checking how far I'd gone. My thighs burned. My back tightened. I hadn't eaten. I hadn't spoken. But something about the walking, the steady pace, gave me a strange sense of control. I thought about turning back, but I didn't even know where back was anymore. Not the station. Not my house. I kept walking. Near late afternoon, the land started to change. A small green gas station appeared in the distance, faded and leaning, like it had given up, holding itself up. I leaned against the side wall, pressing my palm to my chest, just breathing through my nose until the tightness eased. A pickup truck pulled into the lot. Old, rust-colored. A man stepped out, wearing a flannel shirt and worn jeans. He looked like the kind of man who knew how to fix things without talking about them. He glanced at me. Didn't stare. Just nodded, like we'd met once in a different life. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. When he came out of the station, he paused near me. "You from around here?" His voice was calm, not pushy. I looked up and said quietly, "I was left at the station." His eyes softened. "I know the one. Used to work there before they cut hours." He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask what happened. He just said, "You need a ride somewhere." I paused. Not because I was afraid, but because trust had become a fragile thing. I nodded. Yes. Not because I knew where I was going, but because I had to keep going. He opened the passenger door and stepped back. I climbed in. The seat was warm from the sun. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like space to breathe. He drove slow, like someone who knew the road by heart. Every turn was gentle. Every bump expected. I stared out the window, watching fields blur into trees and fences and power lines. We didn't speak. That silence said more than words ever could. For the first time since that morning, I didn't feel invisible. Eventually, I asked for his name. "Harold," he said, not taking his eyes off the road. I nodded and told him mine. He didn't act surprised. Didn't even blink. Just kept driving like my name had always belonged in his truck. By the time we reached his house, the sky had turned to late gold. It was a modest place, tucked behind a row of oaks that had long since lost their leaves. The porch creaked under my weight. Inside, he handed me a sandwich wrapped in wax paper and a cup of black coffee. I ate slowly. Not because I wasn't hungry, but because I didn't want to finish too fast. Each bite reminded me I was still here. He didn't press for details, just pointed to the guest room and said it was made up. I thanked him. Not with words, but with the way I sat still and let my shoulders drop for the first time in hours. That night, I didn't sleep much. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old quilts. But I lay still, listening to the wind move through the trees. And for the first time, I wasn't waiting for someone to come back. I wasn't okay. But I wasn't waiting anymore either. I had started walking. And I hadn't stopped. And maybe that was something. Maybe that was enough for now. Harold dropped me off the next morning. He didn't say much. Just waited until I got the door open and gave a quiet nod before pulling away. The house looked the same. But it didn't feel like mine. I stepped inside and stood still. The scent was off. Not the warm lavender I always used. But something sharper. Almost like lemon cleaner I hadn't touched in years. I walked through the kitchen. The chairs were slightly out of place. The rug near the back door had been moved and tucked under like someone had tried to straighten it without knowing how I kept things. In my bedroom, one of the dresser drawers was left cracked. Inside, my files had been shifted. I kept everything in labeled folders. And now those tabs were out of order. Edges bent. Some papers missing. I went to the closet and checked the safe. It was still locked. But the keyhole had faint scratches around it. Not deep. But fresh. Someone had tried to open it. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the silence settle. My hands didn't shake. My breath stayed steady. I had crossed the line between disbelief and knowing. In the living room, I opened my laptop and logged into my banking app. I knew the steps by heart. Security question. Code sent to my phone. Then the account overview. Under permissions, I saw a new name. Jenna L. Moore. Added 3 days ago. No transfers yet. But that didn't matter. The intention was there. I didn't panic. I closed the screen and sat back in the chair near the window. The same one I used to read in after dinner. Back when things felt quieter. I thought about the scarf Jenna handed me. The thermos of tea. How she smiled with that tilted head and said it would be healing. She said it with a kind of soft force. Like I was a child being soothed after a tantrum. I thought about Adam. How he never looked me in the eye anymore. How his voice had gotten that soft edge. Like he was apologizing without actually saying anything. I had mistaken it for guilt. But it was strategy. The note at the train station made sense now. It wasn't a message for me. It was a test. If I came back confused, lost, maybe they'd say I wasn't capable of handling things. If I didn't come back at all, they'd take that silence and turn it into permission. I stood up, walked to the hall closet, and pulled out my old travel bag. I kept it there just in case. Inside, I placed a fresh notebook. Up in. And the burner phone I had never activated. I zipped the bag and pushed it under the bed. Then I opened the drawer next to the kitchen sink and found the tiny sticker I'd bought years ago. I placed it carefully behind the front door lock. If it moved, I'd know. If they came again, I'd be ready. I wasn't scared. Not anymore. I was awake. The next time Jenna came over, I let the kettle whistle longer than usual. I left the cabinet door open and pretended not to notice. She smiled like someone watching a toddler try to put on shoes. I started writing appointments that didn't exist on the calendar by the fridge. Lunch with Marcy. Call with Dr. Ellis. I made sure the handwriting looked a little messier than mine normally did. She noticed the first one 2 days later and asked gently if I had actually gone to lunch. I told her I thought I had. But maybe I had mixed up the day. Her nod was subtle, almost satisfied. That afternoon, I left a sticky note on the bathroom mirror. It said, "Remember to turn off stove." She saw it. She didn't say anything then. But later I found her phone tilted just enough to suggest a photo had been taken. In the evening, I went to the hall closet and pulled out an old tape recorder. The kind with dust in the buttons and batteries held in with tape. I tested it with a fresh pair from the junk drawer. The red light still blinked. I placed it under the cushion of the armchair across from the kitchen table. Jenna always sat there. I made tea the way she liked it and waited. She arrived with banana bread and a too-sweet smile. "I missed our talks," she said, brushing my shoulder like I was glass. I nodded and poured her tea. We talked about her students, hair, garden. And then she leaned forward, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. She mentioned she had brought me something helpful. A planner, something to keep track of my week. She thought it might make things easier. Inside the front pocket was a folded pamphlet about support services for aging adults. She called it just a resource. Nothing serious. Just in case. I thanked her and excused myself to the kitchen. The recorder was tucked under the drawer, quietly catching everything. Later that night, I played it back. Her voice was calm. "Controlled?" She said. "Brendan and I just want her to feel safe. We're not doing anything yet. Just setting things up in case she declines." I rewound that part twice. Then I copied the recording to a thumb drive and labeled it June Visit. I placed it in an old sewing tin in the back of the linen closet. One Jenna had given me herself. The next day, I let the water boil over while cooking pasta. I frowned and said I must have lost track of time. Brendan didn't say much. Just looked at Jenna like a checklist had been completed. That night, I wrote down every detail in my new notebook. I used short lines, like chart notes. Planner. Support pamphlet. Mentions decline. Watches reactions. Collecting proof. Strategy confirmed. I slipped the notebook behind a loose board in the hallway. A spot only I and Frank used to know. I sat in the dark afterward. Hands still. Heart steady. They thought I wouldn't notice. That was their mistake. I was letting them show their plan. Step by careful step. 2 days later, Brendan stopped by with soup. He asked if I had taken my pills that day. I smiled and told him I wasn't sure. Maybe I had. Maybe I hadn't. His hand tightened around the bag. He said he and Jenna were thinking about helping with some of the bills. He used the word simplify. He said it like it was kindness. Like it would help me rest. That evening, I placed a new label on the tape. August visit. Phrases included simplify. Day to day. Early preparation. I backed it up twice. Once to the drive. Once to paper. They thought they were building something quiet. So was I. I called Martha Reed's just after dinner. Her number was still in my old planner from our yoga days. Back when I thought the hardest thing I'd have to survive was widowhood. She picked up on the second ring and asked if I still blamed that draft for knocking me out of tree pose. I laughed softly. But it didn't last. When I told her what had been happening, her tone changed. She didn't gasp or sound surprised. Just quiet. Direct. Calm. "You've got documentation?" she asked. I told her yes. I had recordings. A notebook. Even dates and phrasing. She told me not to confront anyone. Not yet. We met the next afternoon in a small side room at the senior legal center. The place smelled like wood polish and old paper. Familiar. Safe. She wore a gray blazer and flat shoes like armor. I handed her the USB. My most recent will. And a printed backup of my notes. She looked at the contents slowly. Then looked at me and said, "This is more than enough." She explained something called a preemptive protective injunction. A way to freeze all changes before someone else tried to file on my behalf. No alarms. No warning. Just a quiet stop sign that stayed in place until a hearing. I nodded. My throat was dry. I signed the form and watched as she slid the folder into a locked drawer. "You're no longer vulnerable," she said. "You're prepared." That night, I packed a small suitcase. I didn't take much. Just my birth certificate. Social security card. The thumb drive. And my notebook. The rest could stay. The furniture. The wedding china Jenna always hated. The framed photos on the shelf that felt like they belonged to a different life. Harold picked me up at sunrise. I didn't tell him much. But I didn't need to. He opened the passenger door and handed me a travel mug of coffee. No questions. Just presents. We drove north. Past the old county line. Into a quiet neighborhood where his sister used to live. The small house she left behind was mostly used for storage. He had already cleared a room for me. It was one story. With faded curtains and creaky floors. But it was clean. Untouched. Neutral. A blank page. I placed the USB and a sealed envelope into Harold's coat pocket. He didn't open them. Just tapped the side gently and said he'd keep them safe. I believed him. He had already added a second lock to the back door. I noticed it but didn't say anything. Some people show care by stepping back and staying close at the same time. Later that evening, we sat in the living room, sipping tea from mismatched mugs. The radio played low. Nothing dramatic. Just soft talk about the weather and high pollen. I didn't cry. I didn't vent. I just breathed a little deeper than I had in weeks. My hands stopped twitching when I reached for the mug. My shoulders didn't rise quite so high. That night, I slept through the night. Not because the danger had passed, but because I had moved first. I wasn't running. I wasn't hiding. I was reclaiming the silence before someone else filled it with lies. The appointment was set for 10:38. Brendan wore a pale blue dress shirt and polished shoes. Kayla had on a navy blazer, she usually saved for interviews and sympathy visits. They arrived 10 minutes early and signed in at the front desk. The bank manager had already been notified. He had received a certified letter 3 days before with a sealed injunction and a formal list of restricted actions. It bore my name and my signature. Kayla smiled like someone expecting a favor. Brendan stood beside her. Quiet. Hands folded in front of him. The manager walked them into a private room. One of those glassed-in cubicles meant to feel secure but not intimate. She opened the meeting by stating they were there on my behalf. She said I had been having trouble lately and had asked them to help with day-to-day finances. The manager listened without expression. Then tapped a few keys on his screen. He asked for documentation. Kayla slid a printed letter across the table. It was signed by her. Not by me. It used words like emotionally overwhelmed and temporarily confused. It referenced future planning and safe financial oversight. The manager didn't pick it up. He glanced at it once. Then looked back at the screen. He told them the account had been flagged with a temporary freeze. He explained that a court order had been filed, naming me as the sole authorized decision-maker until further notice. Brendan didn't move. His jaw tightened slightly, but his face stayed neutral. Kayla leaned forward, her voice smoothing itself out. She said there must be a misunderstanding. She said I had probably forgotten to mention it to them. The manager stayed still. He said he couldn't override a legal directive. The freeze would remain in place until a hearing, if one were requested. Otherwise, no access, no changes, no transfers. Kayla's tone changed. Just a little. She asked to speak with someone else. The manager told her he was the senior authority on site. She asked again. He shook his head. She raised her voice. A security officer approached the glass room. Not urgently. Just present. Brendan cleared his throat and said, maybe it would be best to check in with me first. He looked tired. Kayla reached for the letter, folded it sharply, and tucked it back into her purse. She stood slowly, lips tight, eyes scanning the walls like something had betrayed her. Brendan followed behind, not saying anything else. They left without fanfare. No shouting. No confrontation. Just silence that felt heavier than words. The bank manager turned back to his screen and updated the file. That same afternoon, Martha called me at Harold's. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the quiet satisfaction underneath. They tried, she said. But the account is sealed tight. You're safe. I didn't smile. I didn't cheer. I just closed my eyes for a moment and let the news settle. Not because I doubted it, but because I had already known. They thought they were ahead of me. They thought I wouldn't notice the forms, the shifts, the access changes. They thought they could rewrite my role in my own life and present it as help. But help without consent is control. And concern without trust is something darker. They hadn't expected resistance. Not legal. Not quiet. Not documented. They expected confusion, tears, or silence. They didn't know silence could also mean strategy. That day at the bank was never about confrontation. It was about truth finding a boundary. And for the first time in weeks, I felt that boundary hold. I left before sunrise. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't ask questions. I moved slowly. Not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to remember the way it felt to leave on my own terms. I took one suitcase and my small canvas bag. Inside were the documents Martha helped me safeguard and a single photograph of Frank and me on our porch 30 years ago. I didn't take much else. The porch light was off. The sticker behind the door was still there. Untouched. I left an envelope just inside the front door. I didn't reread the letter. I already knew what it said. Harold waited in his truck with the heater on low. He didn't speak, just reached over and handed me a thermos of hot tea. We drove in silence through the back roads. The frost on the grass hadn't melted yet. It felt clean, like something had ended without the need for anyone to announce it. The house was a small rental near the edge of town. 1 story, 2 bedrooms. The front door creaked and the kitchen light flickered when it warmed up. But it was mine. The first thing I did was set the folded notebook in the drawer beside the bed. I slipped the key into my purse and pressed it into the side pocket where I could feel it when I walked. Later that day, I called Martha. She told me the freeze order had gone through. She said no further action would be allowed without my in-person signature. I thanked her and then asked about the foundation paperwork. We had spoken about it before. Quietly. I didn't want to build something for show. I wanted it to be useful. A place where women over 60 could ask hard questions. Where they could get help with banking. Wills. And the kind of documents that too often fall into the wrong hands. A place where no one would say they were confused just because they asked to understand. We named it the Quiet House Project. I wanted it to sound soft. Not because what we were doing was soft, but because it was strong without needing to shout. That night, I lit a candle in the kitchen and folded laundry with the windows open. The breeze carried the smell of pine from the trees nearby. I stood there barefoot, listening to the wind move through the screens. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel bitter. What I felt was room. Room to breathe. Room to rebuild. Frank used to say peace didn't mean nothing happens. It meant you stop waiting for something that never should have started. I understood that now. They had written a version of my life without asking me to speak. I didn't fight to punish them. I stepped away to reclaim the pen. And now, each morning, I write again. Nothing grand. Just a few lines about the sky. The quiet. The smell of coffee. And the fact that I'm still here. Still choosing. Still Mina. Looking back now, I don't think what happened to me was rare. It was just quiet. It started with small things. Gentle suggestions. Too much help. The kind that feels like love, until it starts closing doors. I used to believe family meant safety. That the people you raised wouldn't be the ones to take your voice away. But sometimes, they believe they know what's best for you long before they ask if you agree. What I've learned is this. You don't have to yell to protect yourself. You don't need to win a battle to walk away. Sometimes, The most powerful thing you can do is choose a different ending. I am not the same woman who sat on that bench at the station. That version of me was hoping for warmth. She wanted to believe she still belonged in someone else's plans. But the version of me now doesn't wait to be invited. I speak more slowly. But not because I'm unsure. I pause because I've earned the right to think. To decide. To ask questions and expect clear answers. The truth is, what they tried to do had less to do with my memory and more to do with their comfort. They weren't afraid I'd forget. They were afraid I'd remember and act before they could finish. And I did. I remembered where I came from. I remembered what Frank and I built. I remembered how to listen to the small voice inside that said, "You are not wrong. You are not lost." Now I use that voice for something larger. Through the foundation, I've met women who carry stories like mine in their pockets. Too scared or too tired to speak them aloud. And I sit with them. I nod. I make space. Because sometimes, what we need isn't someone to fix it. We just need someone to believe us. To witness the truth without making it smaller. If you're watching this, and something about my story feels familiar, I hope you hear me clearly. You are not alone. If you feel like your silence has been mistaken for weakness, there is still time to change the ending. It doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't have to be public. It just has to be yours. And if this story gave you strength, even a little, I'd be grateful if you shared it. Leave a comment. Tell me your story. Or just say, "I'm here," because that matters more than you know.